Hello. We're going to get straight into it, Evie, if that's okay.
Yeah.
And hello to everyone who's joined in with us. Thank you for rolling with the punches with us this morning, in terms of where we are located on the internet, as is just life now. We had some technical issues earlier, but we're so happy to be here to discuss this today. I'm particularly happy because I was saying to the panelists, I'm not an expert on climate change or gender bias, although thoughts. So I'm really looking forward to learning, and hopefully I can help you learn a little bit more about these issues too. So what we do know is that climate change and its consequences are a daily reality for millions of people around the world. And while women and girls already face inequality and discrimination due to gender, it is recognized that change-related crises compound this inequality, with some of the poorest and most marginalized women and girls in the world facing adverse effects. So as we are coming into International Women's Day, we thought today would be a good chance for us to discuss these issues and hopefully learn a little bit about what we can do to improve things. And we've got a great panel of guests today. Dr. Sinead Walsh is Climate Director at the Department of Foreign Affairs. Hello, Sinead. And we have Dr. Maria Karan, who is UCC's Sustainability Officer, UCC's first ever Sustainability Officer, which I think is a pretty cool title to have. Then we're joined by Chiku Kalembe, who is Irish Aid Climate Advisor Malawi. And we were hearing cockerels crowing in the background there earlier, giving us a little bit of Malawian atmosphere. Hopefully we'll hear a little bit more of that. And we also are joined by Evie O'Brien, who is the CEO of Food Cloud. So I suppose, Sinead, if it's okay, we'll start with you, because I said that women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate change. Maybe you can tell us exactly how.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important, Louise. I mean, it's a big week this week for us climate people, because the IPCC report came out, and there's a lot that's very worrying in there. But I think what we need to do, and I always think, whenever I think about this, I always think about Mary Robinson. I don't know if people have heard her before, talking about the layers of climate injustice. So she says, look, there's all these climate change issues, but it's not as though they're falling equally. The impacts are falling equally. They're falling most on the poorest and most vulnerable countries. And then within that, they're focusing on the most vulnerable communities. And then within that, they're focusing on women and girls. And I think, I mean, I know Chiku will talk more about this, but, we have to bear in mind that, I suppose in Irish Aid, we've been working in African countries and other sort of poorer countries for decades. And women are always, worse off for education, worse off for health, and I know we can say a lot about the Irish context as well, and our history of this. And then you just compound that with all these climate issues. So, women are usually the ones who have to go in the countries where we work and get the firewood and get the water, and all these things are becoming more and more difficult. There's more climate disasters, and there's evidence that women are more affected by climate disasters. They're more likely to not be able to flee, for example, because maybe they're looking after older people, or vulnerable children. So I think there's a lot in the international sphere where we work, which I think we can all also identify with from a domestic context. But I think I always find it very useful to think about that sort of those layers of injustice, and this shouldn't be surprising to us, right? That discriminations build on existing discriminations and compound them. So
yeah. I was doing some reading this morning, and I read a statistic that I hope it's still accurate, but that 70% of the world's poor are women. And I suppose if you think about that kind of disproportionate representation of people who live in poverty, then obviously climate change has a huge impact on the economy, which therefore has a huge impact on the poorest people in the world. So I guess it makes sense that women would, of course, be the ones who suffer more at the hand of any kind of disaster.
Yeah, and I think, Louise, it's also really important, like we can sometimes focus a lot on the sort of, on those aspects, and they're very valid, but we also need, as well as the risks, to look at how women's contribution to all these sort of climate discussions and so on is not remotely where it should be, right? So if women aren't having the voices at the tables, whether it's at these COP26, that we were just at in Glasgow and so on, if women's voices aren't coming in, then the solutions to the problems, which are, as you say, disproportionately affecting women, are not going to be also what they need to be. And so I think that's also something that we're trying to work on. And it is, I suppose, this concept of, women, women may be victims, but they're not only victims. They're a lot more than that, and they are solution, providers. And I do think sometimes we have a tendency in our sector anyway to maybe focus a bit more on women's vulnerabilities and less on their capabilities to actually influence, the solutions to these kinds of issues.
Yeah. Maria, I saw you nodding your head there. I guess that resonates with you, does it?
Yeah, I suppose I agree wholeheartedly that climate change amplifies existing inequalities and existing vulnerabilities. And that's the same the world over, whether it's in the global south or whether it's in Ireland. So, in Ireland, we do have a situation where women often suffer more from energy poverty. Again, because more women are more likely to suffer from poverty in general. And, women suffer more from the impacts of climate change in terms of all the different kinds of discrimination that we experience every day. So violence, gender-based violence, often is amplified in situations of emergency and crises. And we will see that happening more and more as we see more climate change related disasters happening. So it is, it's absolutely, I think women are impacted unfairly by climate change. But I agree also with what Sinead is saying, that women do have a lot of the solutions, but unfortunately we don't tend to be at the table when it comes to people making those decisions. So for example, I work in sustainability. It's actually quite a female dominated area to work in. Most of the other sustainability officers that I know are female. Most of the people that I work with on sustainability tend to be female, but when it comes to us getting into the room with the presidents or the CEOs of the organizations, we tend to be the only woman in the room. So, I often wonder, is it female dominated because we tend not to be at the highest levels of organizations? That's my experience.
That's such an interesting question. And it also kind of makes me wonder, do you think there's a difference between, in terms of gender with people's attitudes towards sustainability and climate change?
Absolutely, yeah. Sustainability is seen as pink. Women tend to be, so the activist space tends to be dominated by women as well. And women tend to be advertised at more when it comes to kind of, oh, look at the sustainable solution. It's very much aimed at, sustainable fashion, makeup, all these. And I find it's hard actually, because in some ways you wonder, is this empowering that women can make these decisions? Maybe there's more options on the market when it comes to women's products, but also, we as women are the product of decades of advertising telling us that we're not good enough, that we need to look a certain way. And then all of a sudden in the last decade or so, we're being told, well, actually, when we told you that you weren't good enough, when we told you that you needed to have a new outfit every week and that you need to wear this kind of makeup and your hair should look like this. Well, actually, that's really harming the environment now. So you need to sort that out as well. And it's both empowering and a burden. And whether or not it's empowering or a burden depends on where you are in your life, I think, at that time, and your own vulnerabilities, your own ability to make decisions, and your own ability to go out and buy these products, and your own levels of confidence with yourself. I think there's so many different sides to it.
That's so, I had never thought about it that way, but that's such a good point. It's almost like, yeah, this is your problem to solve. You created this and you did that all on your own and there was no other influence involved. Yeah, that's so interesting. Evie, I think it's interesting that you're here because obviously we're talking about the fact that there are so many women who could contribute, really valuably to the conversation, to changes that could lead us to a better place in terms of climate change. And of course, you are one of those women because you're literally doing it. And for people who don't know, can you tell them a little bit about Food Cloud and what it is that you do? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Food Cloud is a social enterprise based here in Dublin, and we redistribute surplus food from the food industry to community groups across Ireland and more recently internationally. So we do it in two ways. One is we have a retail technology platform that allows retailers to donate food from a store directly to community groups across the country. And we also have 3 warehouses in Dublin, Galway and Cork, where we take in large volumes of surplus that hasn't got to the retailer at that stage. And we then manage it and redistribute it to charities across the country. And our retail technology platform is being used now by an equivalent NGO to us in the UK and also in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So basically in partnership with NGOs, we're providing access to our technology, which will help them to grow their impact. And really the big problem we're working to solve is reducing the amount of food that goes to waste. So the latest data tells us that 40% of food produced goes to waste, and it accounts for about 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which compared to the aviation industry, which is 2%, is quite a big, it's a really big problem in terms of our global food system. So we're playing our part in trying to reduce the amount of food that's going to waste and keep it in the supply chain in a way that can support communities, but also create a more sustainable food system. And just in terms of gender, I suppose it is clear that women are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change. And from our lens, which is an Irish lens as well, what we have seen is like females are more likely to start sustainability businesses. And also they're very good leaders in a crisis, which has also really become obvious to us during the COVID-19 crisis at a community level. And what our experience in Ireland is also that it's the females at a community level are those who galvanise action. So whether that's your Meals on Wheels, your after schools clubs, your breakfast club, in terms of making kind of a just transition to climate issues, we do see at a community level, it is the women that are creating change and making action, not solely, but generally it is a lot of activism. So we see women as playing a huge role in addressing the impacts of climate change and trying to mitigate it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I remember when I first learned about the impact of food waste on climate change, my mind was absolutely blown. I think that statistic, when you compare the aviation impact versus the climate change or the food waste impact would be shocking to a lot of people. It certainly was when I first learned it. And I suppose I think a lot of people might think about your business and think about what you do and think, oh, that's great. Nobody likes to think of there being hungry people and, there being excess food, but it is so much more than that. Like the fact that, the travel, the production, everything that goes into creating food and getting food to people all goes to waste when that food goes in the bin. Like that's something I think that people don't necessarily put together. So it's great to kind of say that explicitly, I think. And I every time I've heard you, obviously we've spoken before, and my mind is blown every time, even though I know. And then I also start feeling guilty about the lettuce in the fridge that I don't know, like when I bought it. But I am trying. We're all trying.
Yeah. And I think in terms of a climate activity, food waste is like a lot of it can be quite overwhelming. in terms of what to take action on. But I suppose in terms of something that you can tangibly make a difference on 3 times a day in the home, like it is something that's quite tangible and very impactful. So yeah, and it is women that are generally doing the shopping and the buying as well. So there is massive power in women to take action on this particular topic in relation to climate change as well.
Yeah. Chico, we've talked a good bit about Ireland there, but you obviously are working with Irish Aid in Malawi. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do and about the specific issues that women are facing there, which are impacted by climate change?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me for this session. First of all, I should mention that Malawi, for the past 5, 6, 7 years, has experienced more shocks related to climate change than I think most countries in the world. Maybe let's start from 2015. There was a flood, and then in 2016 there was a major drought. In 2019 there was Cyclone Idai. I think most of us heard about in the media. And then recently, just this year, we've experienced one of the worst floods ever, the Cyclone Anna. And these events continue to happen every year. And despite all of this, I think we might want to know a little bit about Malawi and some of the facts that underpin food production, for instance, as part of the whole production process. In Malawi, women produce 70% of the food that is consumed nationally. And if we talk about 70% of this food, the food is produced on just a third of the land that is available to them, which means the rest of the land is owned by men. And this is a very critical statistic, because at the end of the day, you see that I think in terms of studies that have been done, they show that women who own the plots of land where they're producing food, the plots are 12% smaller and 25% less productive than their male counterparts. But I think if you go back, we're already seeing that they're producing 70% of the food that is fed locally to the local population. You can already see the imbalance there. So it means women do not have really the productive resources. They don't have access to resources, and they're not getting the benefits that they're supposed to get. That's a very big issue. And when you factor in the issue that now they're experiencing more events that will impact their lives in terms of climate, you're talking about floods, you're talking about droughts, then it makes the food production process to be very difficult for women in Malawi. So as the Embassy of Ireland here, we've been promoting a lot of activities around climate smart agriculture, promoting conservation farming, for instance, providing support in terms of improved seeds, because I think what we've seen over the years is that with the changing climate, more seasons are not predictable. So you need to have very high quality seeds that, one, they have to mature quickly, and then they have to be high yielding. And the embassy also has been providing support in terms of providing training to women-linked businesses in agriculture, making sure that there are more businesses that are promoting, that are producing, but they are women-led. But very importantly, and this is one of the things that we are proud of, is about cook stoves, the improved cook stoves. Over the years, Malawi has witnessed a lot of deforestation, and in Malawi, we introduced the improved cook stoves that are really benefiting a lot of women in rural areas because they consume less firewood, and I think 40 to 50% less than what would have happened in open fires. And apart from that, they are very efficient, that they reduce indoor air pollution, and this has significantly reduced some diseases that are related to respiratory function of the body. So respiratory infections have dropped quite significantly. So that's quite significant for us, and it has really helped to turn around some lives. But it's also important to note that we've also been responding to the humanitarian crisis over the years, helping women to be responsive, to be actors in the humanitarian response chain, making sure that they are empowered and that we avoid violence, gender-based violence in the camps and in various aspects of their lives. And lastly, there's also a very significant program that the Irish government has been providing here about social protection, providing cash to the bottom 10%. And this cash helps them in many ways, including during the time when they don't have enough food or when they are in the lean period. It's significant. It's small amount, but very significant because it comes at the time when they need it most.
Yeah.
So let me stop there for now.
I think I can't even imagine how frustrating it must be to go through repeated, situations like that, or environmental changes like that, drought, flooding. I presume people are just back on their feet, and then here comes something else. Like, how are people keeping going? I mean, how do they keep their heads up, if you're losing things over and over again?
Yeah, it's quite difficult, to be honest with you, because having floods, experiencing floods within a period of, let's say, 2 years is very, very traumatic for most of these households. And they are in a situation where they are trying to recover from a flood or trying to recover from a drought, and then immediately they are hit with another one. It's really frustrating. We try to make sure that we provide the necessary support, with the government of Malawi and other stakeholders, NGOs, the private sector, and other players. But it's always difficult. And I think Sinead will agree with me that when we were at the COP26 this year, there was a very good discussion that was coming in and passionately from the Malawi government and other sectors about ensuring that there's sufficient investment in loss and damage. It's still a conversation that is ongoing, but I think it's something that countries like Malawi really need, and something that must be considered maybe at international level in this global forest. So it's really frustrating, to answer your question.
Sinead, working in this area and obviously being acutely aware of the way that climate change is impacting people's lives around the world and in countries like Malawi specifically, how do you feel when you see people not taking the issue of climate change seriously?
Yeah, I think there's quite a bit of discussion at the moment about climate change and mental health, and I think for a lot of people who work on climate, and particularly a lot of youth actually, and kids learning about this, it's really going to be a growing area. I think it's difficult for all of us, I suppose, who work on this every day, and then you see people on Twitter or whatever saying, oh, well, it doesn't matter what Ireland does because we're only this percentage of the world, as if that's okay. And if every country did that, and every country could say, well, we're only this percentage of emissions, and what does it matter? And it is so frustrating. But I think a little bit like Evan's kind of example for us, I think we just have to push forward, right? We all have to kind of find areas where we can do positive things, because I think one could get very wrapped up and very frustrated, even with your own friends and family, and you see people, sort of, doing things or not doing things, or, kind of, oh, I couldn't be bothered recycling, sure, what's the difference? Or, this kind of stuff. And I suppose not really recognizing, like, Ireland's per capita emissions, per head emissions are extremely high. I think it's 7.6 tons, which is like almost 4 times the Chinese person, so we often don't think about that, and what's that, each of us then has that kind of level of responsibility. But I think, as you're saying, Louise, I mean, it's maybe in when we're working with people like Chico and his colleagues, and they're working with these women at the community level. But it does come back to this climate justice issue, because the countries and the communities that are suffering most here have contributed almost nothing to the problem. I mean, emissions in Africa are absolutely negligible. I think it's something like 3%. And then we in the Western world, I mean, we have essentially, and our ancestors created this problem. And then I think there's always a bit of a I'm always a bit uncomfortable with the word resilience when we talk about, you know, helping people to build resilience, because it's almost as though it's saying, well, we've created these problems, you're the one suffering the most, and we would like you then just to sort of hang in there and, you know, and as you're pointing out, you know, the kind of disasters that the people that we work with in Africa and in other parts of the world are dealing with are just unimaginable, really. But again, we you know, we've got to kind of push forward and, you know, support. And I think, you know, it reminds me as well of some of the conversations that were happening around COVID in Ireland, you know, that maybe if we had more women at the decision-making table, maybe some of the decisions could have been different. And I think, you know, part of our challenge is yes, to support, you know, women, you know, after the kind of climate disasters that Chiku has talked about, yes, to support women in the sort of longer term, you know, livelihoods way, but also to support them to be more at the decision-making table. And, you know, Chiku mentioned COP26, where he and I were in Glasgow in November. And, you know, I think it is always, you know, sort of a kind of a thing where people are supported, and we support women, for example, and youth to come to COP and so on. But you really need to, and this is what we're trying to do, it's not enough just to say, okay, here's a flight and some hotel room, you go to this conference. This is a massive, highly technical event. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, okay, there's a whole series of training events and courses and so on that we're going to bring you through, so that when you come to the decision-making table, that you can really, you know, say something with confidence and that you're ready. It's also about getting more women in politics. Maybe a topic for another day, but you know, but you know, we need. It comes back to the point that Maria was making. You know, I mean, we're also in a very female-dominated sector on the international side, and yet, when you look at the most senior levels, we are dealing almost exclusively with men. So how do we? You know, so there's short-term responses and there's long-term responses, I suppose, and we need to make sure that we're supporting women both in the very urgent ways, but also in these kind of long-term, more structural ways, so that we can make longer-term changes, you know?
Yeah, that makes total sense. It's kind of, it's always like, it's like your short-term and your long-term goals. Maria, I'm interested because I was thinking there when Sinead was talking about the fact that, you know, the people who are currently being kind of most adversely affected are the people who contribute the least to the problem. I was thinking, God, I mean, maybe we just all need to be confronted with that a little bit more. But then I also think that there can be a little bit of a kind of check out almost by some people. I think some people feel like exhausted by climate change, or like it's almost too big for them to think about or fathom. And then I also think that there's a little bit of a dangerous narrative that's like, oh, as an individual, you can't actually do anything. It's the big corporations who need to deal with this. But obviously, you know, you in your job are trying to make changes at kind of a base level. So I suppose I have several questions within this. One, how do you try and combat that fatigue, if you will, and get people kind of activated in this area? And two, what are the things that you're doing on campus to try and improve the situation?
Yeah, the fatigue is so real, and I feel it myself. And sometimes I think, I'd love to check out too. So there is an argument, and an oft-cited argument of, yes, I can't do anything as an individual. The change needs to come from the system. What I would always say to people is that if my TD knocks on my door and I say, you need to change the system, I also want to be able to say, I've done all this, you know, I've bought the reusable nappies, I've bought the heat pump, I take the bus to work, I do all of these individual actions. Has it made an impact? Not massively, but, you know, I've come as far as I can, and you need to do that too. And that's actually the kind of approach that we have tried to take on campus as well. So we run a lot of behaviour change campaigns with our students, with our staff. So we had a really huge Green Library programme there a couple of years ago, where we We did, I guess, simple measures like turning off the lights in the library, changing around the bins to improve recycling, and you know, making all these changes that might seem small at an individual level, but across the whole university, when everybody is exposed to this, actually the impact is much bigger. And then, you know, at the top levels of the university as well, kind of talking to those decision makers and getting the big commitments made. So, for example, we divested from fossil fuels, we signed up to the principles of responsible investment. So all of our university fund is now invested in positive environmental and social projects. So what we're trying to do, I guess, is demonstrate the actions on the ground from our staff and students, and also the top level decisions, and then, you know, show how when all those things are done together, actually it can transform. Well, it has transformed our university. I would say that green sustainability is a core value now of the university, and it just goes to show that when everybody works together, that can actually happen. I was really interested actually with the discussion there about how, you know, the people that, like you were saying, the people that contribute the least suffer the most. And it's actually kind of true for our youth as well, you know. So obviously in my job, I work a lot with young people, and, you know, they haven't been around long enough to cause a lot of the harm that we're seeing happen in our environment, but they're going to be the ones that are dealing with it. And a lot, like in some ways, we do have to just accept that our environment has changed, and that our climate is changing, and that we're not going to have the same security of climate that we've had before. So one of the things that we do with our students actually is we run eco-grief workshops, where we allow them to accept these changes and to work through the grief that they feel because of that, and the anger that they feel because of that. So that's one element of what we do also. And I found what Sinead was saying as well really interesting around the resilience. And I completely understand what you're saying, but I think where resilience gets it wrong is where it doesn't include everyone. Again, you know, and this is what it's all about, and this is what we're doing at UCC as well, is trying to bring everyone together, trying to have all of our stakeholders involved in the decision making. And I think it was really interesting, the IPCC report that came out at the start of the week actually spoke a lot about maladaptation. So when we adapt to the effects of climate change that we know are going to happen, but when we don't include all of the decision makers and all of the stakeholders in those adaptation actions, sometimes we get it wrong. And there can be unintended consequences that actually, again, impact on our more vulnerable people more than it should. So yeah, there's a lot to it, but absolutely collaboration, bringing everyone along, including all elements of the diversity of stakeholders, and absolutely gender needs to be part of that too.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I suppose, you know, when you made the point about thinking about what you could say to a TD at your door about what you've done, and then, you know, what can they do? It is really, isn't it about doing what, like, if we're all doing all that we can, there will be vast improvement, because maybe perhaps me, Louise, there, you know, I can be a little bit more sensible about my food. I can drive an electric car. I can walk, you know, there are various things that I can do, and they might seem minor, but, you know, that person at the next level, that politician, can do a little bit more in terms of policy. And then the person at the next level can do a little bit more. So it's about doing what you can, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. You know, and like Evie said, I mean, food waste is a huge source of carbon emissions. The food that we eat has a massive impact on our carbon footprint. The cars that we drive, I saw something recently, SUVs, if you added them all up across the world, they would have the same impact as, I think, the third highest country emitter. So there are big impact items that we as individuals can change in our lives and have a major impact. Definitely the food that we eat, the cars that we drive, the way that we get around. And obviously there are systemic changes that need to happen to enable us to do those things. And they also do have a gender a gender aspect. So for example, do women feel safe on public transport? That's a huge issue when it comes to improving the carbon emissions from commuting to and from our university, for example. But there are changes that we can make that will have a big impact individually when they're all added up together.
I suppose it's interesting when I say like, well, you do what you can, that does raise the question, what can you do and how far can you go? And I'm interested, like, even you're obviously doing great work and you are doing more than many individuals via your work. What motivated you to kind of take on this particular problem of food waste?
Yeah, I was working in London actually, and I was working in banking, and there was a lot happening around. It was in kind of the depths of the last recession in kind of 2009, and there was a lot happening around food sharing around the UK, especially around London. And when I moved back to Dublin to do a master's, I thought, oh, I'll get involved in whatever's going on here. And there was very little happening in Dublin at that time. So I suppose I was really motivated to, what I find really interesting around food is that it's so important to all of our interactions. So, you know, it's important to a celebration of events. It's important to, you know, how we can concentrate in school. It's just such an important thing. And why we were so interested in establishing Food Cloud was that idea of bringing the food industry and the community sector together to share food, to solve each other's problems, to work together. And when we started out, that was really inspiring to see, you know, a store manager of a store giving them, I suppose, the tools to take action, and empowering them to work together on what is a very local community level. We're talking about, you know, swapping food at a, you know, in Cashel, County Tipperary, but that has a massive global impact. And I think that whole climate, feeling overwhelmed about the issue of climate change, if we can be empowered and have the tools to take action, we will do that. So that was really, I suppose, what started as a really big interest in food sustainability. And then seeing how by sharing food, we could bring communities together and bring all of the actors in the food supply chain together. It just kind of spirals then in terms of, well, if this is happening in one community in one place in Ireland, could this happen globally? Could we be working more closely together? So it really is around bringing people together and providing solutions for people to be able to take action, whether it's, you know, in our case, it's a warehouse manager to a store manager to a after schools club, all working together. And that's what needs to happen, because in our case, like, you know, we have a broken food system. Like, food waste is a big issue, but it's actually part of a wider system where there's so many issues at play. But if you know, just taking action on a very local way with a global impact is what's really inspiring about, I suppose, continuing to work with Food Cloud and continuing to work on the particular challenge that we've decided to work on.
Yeah, it's interesting because what you're saying is kind of, you know, about empowering people to take action. Do you find that the will and the motivation and the enthusiasm is there once people are provided with the tools?
Yeah, I mean, like, it's very, like, we're all time poor. It's, you know, whether you're working in a supermarket or whether you're at home cooking. And if there is a need for things to, for people to be empowered as to what they can do. And so we would definitely see our role as to removing the barriers to wasting food and providing an opportunity for people to take action. And our job is the intermediary for two time poor resources, and just saying, look, you know, what's the problem? Okay, we'll take that away. We'll think about it. We'll see what we can do. So for us, it was like food safety. Somebody's going to get sick if they take surplus food and use it. Okay, how can we remove that barrier? Logistics. Okay, how can we remove that barrier? And working through. And like, the feedback from people that work with us and benefit from our services is just that we just try and make it as easy as possible for people to take action. And I think it does have to be relatively easy, especially when we don't have all of the time in the world to do all the things that we know that are the right things to do. So that's what we want to do. We continue working on trying to make it more efficient for food companies, taking away all the excuses, basically, on both sides.
Yeah, I suppose I'm thinking about how we can kind of feed that out into the other areas that we need to work on, and how we can break down the barriers for people to be able to take action and feel empowered to take action. It's interesting.
Yeah, and sometimes it's funding. So it's, you know, sometimes it's actually provided, like we've just done a project with the horticulture sector in Ireland and looking at kind of farm level food waste. And ultimately, like, it's very hard to invest in innovations to reduce food waste when you don't have capital to invest in it. So like sometimes the barriers to innovation is funding, and that's, I suppose, the work of Irish Aid and is so important in that regard. But in terms of climate adaptation, there's no doubt that there needs to be a massive movement of capital to fund climate adaptation initiatives and projects. And I think I just read a stat that I think only 2% of global philanthropy is targeted at climate change initiatives. Now, I don't know if I have to fully fact check that, but you know, it needs a massive movement of capital to support. And hope if that was directed towards female-led initiatives, like how powerful would that be? Because you're bringing a green wave and you know, a gender equality way as well.
Yeah, that would be amazing. I'm kind of conscious of the fact, Chiku, that you know, we've been talking about the fact that, you know, in this kind of broad way about the fact that, you know, a lot of the damage that's being done is being done outside of Malawi. Malawi is one of the countries that is most acutely experiencing the impacts of climate change. Is that a feeling of injustice present in people's thinking in Malawi?
Yeah, there is a feeling of injustice, I must be honest, because, you know, in terms of economic progression of the country, it's always affected by these kind of disasters. After the 2015 floods, there was, I think, an estimation that about 6% of the GDP was lost. And these are massive figures. And I think there's that kind of frustration. But at the same time, there's also a feeling that, I mean, we can't just sit and wait. There has to be something that we have to do ourselves. And communities do kind of mobilize themselves to ensure that they're doing what they can. But I think there's still need for a lot of support to ensure that the goals of adaptation are met, because every year there is some sort of disaster that happens. Either there's a drought, or maybe there's a flood, or maybe a dry spell somewhere, which pushes people out of, you know, their expectation, what they're supposed to achieve at the end of the year. So it's something that needs to be addressed, I think. And I think very importantly for this topic is the issue around how women are affected, because apart from being affected, we realize that they are a group of people who can really make a difference. Because I've already mentioned about the production, how almost all the food, we're talking about 70% of the food that is consumed locally, is grown by women. They have a massive potential to contribute to the development of the country, to adaptation. I mean, all the adaptation initiatives, if they don't put women at the forefront, then they are bound to fail, especially in a Malawian context. So it's a realization that has come in, and I think there are a lot of things that are happening. We in the embassy have seen this, and most of our programs, we're talking about more than 50% of our target. I think over the years, the figures show that we've been really trying to work with women groups and cooperatives and other groups. And apart from that, we've also been trying to influence at national level. There is a movement that we are part of as an embassy for gender equality, and I think made up of a number of NGOs that are supporting work to ensure that women voices are heard at national level and international level, and that issues of climate are also mainstreamed in this. And I think people keep talking about them, because sometimes not talking about these issues assume that they're not happening. But if we initiate the conversation at national level, and then we transcend that to international level, then people can actually see what is happening, and I think they can be part of the movement.
Yeah. I suppose we've got a few minutes left, and I suppose my last question and it would be to each of you is, so we know it's clear that women are more adversely affected by climate change. It seems that women are also being kind of foisted the responsibility in many ways for climate change as well. What can we do about that? And I suppose I'll start with you, Sinead.
Yeah, I mean, a few thoughts I think that just other panelists have made me think about. I think one thing we can do is vote. I on a reasonably regular basis chat to kind of youth activists, and sometimes when I press them, they admit that they don't vote. And, you know, frankly, all the protests in the world are only going to be, a part of this picture. And if we're not putting the people that we want, who share the values and the kind of, the activism on the issues that we care about, we're not playing our part in that political process, then it's our own fault, really, isn't it? in democratic countries, right? So that's one thing I think we just all need to take responsibility for. But I've been really struck, I think, by some of the parallels between, what Ciku and Aoibhinn have been saying. And I think it's around, we have to recognize that climate related issues are only one portion of the challenges and the issues that people will have, right? So, I mean, there's a spectrum, okay? There's very poor countries, there's countries like Malawi and very poor communities where, people are literally on a day-to-day basis fighting for their survival, right? And then there are, more affluent countries, like our own, where we also have people who are really struggling. And so how do we come up with solutions that address multiple aspects of the issues that people are facing, right? Because if we only talk to people about climate this and green this or whatever, they say, well, that's fantastic, but I can't pay my bills or I can't feed my family. And this is where I think, the theme that I'm sort of picking up from what others have been saying is making it at least possible and ideally easy for people to make these sorts of changes. So, Chiku's talked about in Malawi. Like, another example would be in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone's a coastal country. I lived there for 5 years. Beautiful country, beautiful coastline, very, very vulnerable. The third most vulnerable country in the world to climate change. One of the things we're doing there as Irish Aid is we're funding women's groups to restore mangroves. So we're improving the protection of the coastline and the livelihoods that are linked to the coastline, but we're also giving women, the partners that we work with are giving women livelihoods, essentially. So how do we tick multiple boxes at the same time, recognizing that, a lot of the women that we work with in developing countries, but also in Ireland, are dealing with multitude of different issues. And so I think that's kind of, and I think it comes back to Aoibhinn's point about, making it possible, making it easy, and the role of the private sector. I'm not allowed to say too much about this because it hasn't launched yet, but keep an eye out on Irish Aid's Twitter. We're launching something next week that will very much come to Aoibhinn's point around government investment to help the private sector do more on climate. That's as specific as I'll get away with being today. But I totally agree with that point. And anybody who's listening is involved in the private sector, make sure you have a look and see if that applies to you. But those are just a few thoughts, Louise. I'm stealing from my other panelists there.
No, that's super. And what about you, Maria? What are your thoughts on what we can do moving forward? Let's basically in the next 5 minutes just solve all of these problems.
Yeah, no, it's just Sinead, you keep talking. God, I wish there was an easy answer. Yeah. I mean, basically, we just need to be looking at all of our policies with more of a, with the gender lens, but just with the lens of bringing everyone together, bringing everyone along with us. So, I mean, the issue of finance came up there, and when I was saying earlier that sustainability is seen as kind of a female a female area. It's also seen as being very middle class because a lot of the things that we can do to make our lives more sustainable are expensive, or they involve, you know, investing up front, which a lot of people can't do. So we need to support people to be able to make those investments or make those decisions in their daily lives. I actually, just before I came onto this, I said I'd look at the government's climate action plan, and I went through it to see if gender was mentioned, and it's mentioned 3 times, and 2 of those mentions are in relation to our international work, so what Irish Aid is doing. You know, when we talk about a just transition in Ireland, but the just transition in Ireland is in relation to people who worked in peat extraction or in fossil fuels. We don't talk about the women that are energy poor, like single mothers who can't afford to keep the heating on. We don't talk about those people when we talk about a just transition. So I don't think I've answered your question there at all. But
well, no, I think you have, because I think what you're saying is we need to be more inclusive.
exactly.
And we need to consider gender at a national level as well as at an international level.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's it.
I heard you loud and clear. What's your big solution, Ian? I know you already have contributed quite sizably.
I suppose I would say we work in the food space and the food system sustainability, and it's not to underestimate the power of the consumer. So all of the retailers, like, they're extremely sensitive to consumer trends, consumer insights. It's just that's basically how they run their businesses. So if the power of the consumer is strong in relation to choices made in relation to your food, so the only thing is that you have to kind of practice what you preach in terms of your shopping habits, because they do work on hard data and not sentiment. So it is in relation to what you're buying, what you're not buying, and it is so important. So a lot of, like, I've been recently to retail conferences, and it's all about, you know, the next generation and their focus on more climate neutral or nature positive products. But it does have to follow through in terms of your actual choices. So it's data-based rather than sentiment. So that would be one thing, you know, to actually practice what you preach. And like, for us, if people care about food waste, retailers care about food waste, then the supply chain cares about food waste, but that goes beyond. So it's just to not underestimate the power of being a consumer.
Walk the walk as well as talking the talk. I hear you.
Exactly.
And Chico, excuse me, what would you like to see happen?
I think in the Malawi context, I will still keep saying is this, that in the Malawi context, I think the priority now is to adapt. And to adapt, I think for most of our communities, they need the technologies, they need the money to ensure that they are surviving these harsh conditions. So any work that is to lead to adaptation has to really be at, you know, the center of focus should be the women who hold most of our communities. I think in Malawi, for people who lived in Malawi, they would agree with me that women hold communities. They are seen as the pillars, even though that might not be said in so many events. But the truth is, they are the ones who hold the communities together. And if there are adaptation measures being put forward, they really have to be the center of focus. The women have to be the center of focus. And this brings me to the issue about what we bring at the international table, you know, in negotiations. If you don't bring in women to be at the negotiation table related to climate and adaptation, then those initiatives might not be impactful as opposed to having women there, because they are the ones who really understand these issues, and they can help a lot in changing the landscape. And we also need to recognize that at the moment, in terms of adaptation initiatives, technology is also very important. And where you have a very important technology transforming the food system, for instance, it can make a huge difference to a lot of communities, because one of the issues that Malawi faces continually every year is shortage of food. Things like improved varieties, irrigation technologies, improved markets, just better flow of the produce can really make a huge difference to a number of communities here. So we need to focus on these things, but top of it is that adaptation has to be very inclusive.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. I've learned so much. I hope everyone who's watching has enjoyed as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Sinead Walsh, Climate Director, Department of Foreign Affairs. Thank you, Dr. Maria Karan, UCC Sustainability Officer, the first one ever. And thank you, Chiku Kalembe, Irish Aid Climate Advisor Malawi, and of course, Evan O'Brien, CEO of Food Cloud. Thank you all so much for your contributions.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Louise.
you.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thanks a million.
Bye.